Okay. So just as an introduction, I'm the CEO of Federal Compliance Consulting here in Maryland. I had the privilege of being the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division senior trial attorney. And during my career, I had national responsibility for law enforcement and policy enforcement and development. I'm the testifying expert in various federal, state, and federal lawsuits alleging violations of federal civil rights laws. I am a faculty member at the Georgetown University School of Medicine and the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. I teach implicit bias, cultural awareness, civil rights, and organizational culture. And I put at the end, I am a proud award-winning author. And when my son was in high school, I was the Montgomery County, Maryland PTA President of the Year. During my tenure as the PTA President, we had to deal with various situations of bias, racial profiling, hate incidents, all kinds of significant issues. So what I wanted to start out with is, you may wonder, why is this required and why are we really here today? Well, part of it is that when you receive money from the federal government, you have to sign something called a certificate of assurance, a certificate of compliance, which means that you agree to abide by various federal civil rights laws. So what I thought I would do is just start our program today with some excerpts from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So these are all excerpts from the certificate that you must sign, that the city must sign, that your organizations sign if you receive federal funding, to basically tell the federal government we're going to obey the law. So as you can see in the underlined portion here, you certify that you, as the official authorized to sign on behalf of your organization, provide the following assurances and certifications, starting with I will administer my grant in compliance with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And that law prohibits discrimination based on race, color, or national origin. National origin also includes language-based discrimination. Also, that you will not violate the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and the Age Discrimination Act, both of which prohibit discrimination, the first on the basis of disability, the second on the basis of age. The Rehabilitation Act is similar to the Americans with Disabilities Act. And you're also certifying that you're complying with the Fair Housing Act, which prohibits various forms of discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, disability, familial status, national origin. Discrimination based on sex would also include discrimination based on sexual orientation, sex stereotyping, and sexual identity. And the last paragraph is something that I often talked about during my career with the Justice Department, that the certifications that are made to receive federal funding are relied upon by HUD, by federal agencies, in deciding whether to award the money. If HUD eventually determines that information was provided incorrectly, or that you're violating the laws that you said you would not, that could subject you to criminal prosecution and also the termination of federal funding. So there can be significant consequences to discrimination as a federal funding recipient and as somebody who is acting against what you said you wouldn't do, which is basically to comply with federal civil rights laws. So I wanted to start out with, and this kind of informs what my approach is, every human being has a bias. We all have biases. It is a biochemical reality of our brains, as you'll see. Something that I've learned in working with my medical school colleagues. So I think that starting from the premise that we all have a bias or biases is really important. There's no judgment involved in that. There's no fault finding. It is the reality of being a human being. The question then becomes, well, what do we do with our biases? What happens when there's a manifestation of bias? That's when things become potentially problematic. That's when things can be discriminatory. That's when, if you receive federal funding, you could run afoul of your certification to federal agencies that you won't discriminate. So several of the slides that I'm using, I have borrowed with permission from my medical school colleagues. And I think that this is a really key phrase. It isn't whether you have biases, it's about which one is your bias, and then what do you do with it? You know, in my career as an attorney, and certainly my former federal service, I've seen biases manifested in many, many different ways, ways that can become problems, ways that can become expensive from a liability perspective, ways that can become expensive reputationally, and also if federal funding is terminated. So let's start a little bit about with where we are today. According to the FBI, hate crimes are significantly up, bias incidents, hate incidents. And according to the FBI, they're at a 20-year high. According to a report from 2017, as you can see here, common bias categories include the following, where the bias incidents, according to the FBI, occurred. About 60% were based on race, ethnicity, or ancestry. About 21% based on religion, 16% sexual orientation. So regrettably, of course, the bias incidents tend to be rather broad-based and across the board. You know, as we know from reading recent media accounts and all kinds of reporting, bias and hate incidents and hate crimes against Asian Americans are significantly up. And that is also likely consistent with the FBI's finding of similar incidents against other people being at a 20-year high. So I ask my students this question all the time. Well, what do you do? What do you do? And I think in the context that we're discussing today, as federal funding recipients, as sub-funding recipients of the city of Loveland, as organizations that encounter people with disabilities, people who don't speak English, people whose skin color is different than mine, whose religion may be different than mine, who have a different sexual orientation or gender identity. What do you do? Because all of your actions are implicated in ways that other people's actions may not be, because you receive federal funding, either directly from the federal government or from the city of Loveland. So you're under specific obligations to answer this question in a way that is, of course, legally compliant, but also kind of gives you a window into bias and why you may react or why you may act in a certain way. And this is one of the best examples that I've come across of an example of an image is something that we encounter on a regular basis. This was a Twitter advertisement by the St. Louis Cardinals a few years ago, advertising a promotion about jewelry at a baseball game on May 17th. So as you can see, there's a man and a woman pictured. The man is in a baseball jersey, wearing a baseball cap. The woman is not. Instead, the woman is holding out her right hand and looking at a ring on her finger. And you can see that the man is not doing that. So that one of the implicit messages, and something that my students always tell me, that this image suggests that the woman is not interested really in baseball, but is interested in jewelry. So why would that be true of her and not of the man who is sitting next to her? There's a lot of social media talk about this, a lot of pushback against the Cardinals, but I think that if you look at it objectively and really think through it, we are faced with and encounter images like this throughout our lives. And often, as you'll see later on, our instinctive reactions are often formed by images just like this that suggest an implicit message, an underlying message that we internalize, whatever that message may be. So I think this is something my students always react very quickly to this. And I think it's very instructive about something that seems innocuous, but does have certain underlying suggestions or messages that our brains take pictures of, remember, and we use them instinctively to react to different situations. Montgomery County is where I live, and hate incidents here have been have gone up significantly. And as this TV report suggested or questioned, does this mean there are more hate incidents? Are students more aware of them? And are they empowered to say something? My opinion is that both are true, that empirically there are more incidents, but that also that students may well be more aware of incidents happening that are upsetting to them, disturbing, and they feel empowered to report them. And these are just the next couple of slides, are just examples that I pulled from the media of various factually correct, or not factually correct, of true incidents, true stories of various bias incidents revealing that manifestation of implicit bias that I mentioned earlier. And again, that prompts the question of, well, what do you do when, for example, something like this happens in the workplace? Something like this happens in a public forum. Something like this happens in a way that may be unexpected and surprises you. Well, if you are running an organization and this is happening in your space and you are receiving federal funding, that has very serious.
Bruce, your video froze.
This one is particularly helpful because it is indicative of a very important point about organizational culture. So here you can see the character Michael Scott says, I set the rules, you follow them blindly. And if you have a problem with that, then you can talk to our complaint department. In my experience, organizational culture is key. The tone of an organization is set from the top down. Messages that are either explicit or implicit are internalized by workers, contractors, customers, colleagues, and it really does set the tone for how your organization proceeds, both from a compliance perspective and frankly, how do you treat each other? How do you treat your coworkers and your colleagues? So microaggressions is a very important term. Microaggressions was originally coined, I think, back in the 70s. According to Psychology Today, microaggressions are brief and everyday slights, insults, indignities, and denigrating messages. A good example of that was provided by one of my Georgetown colleagues who is Asian American. She was born in the United States. She is just as I was. She speaks English just as I do. She says virtually every day someone that she encounters says to her, you speak English so well, you have no accent. Where are you from? Now, no one has ever asked me that. And people ask her that every day. That's a good example of a microaggressive comment. Unless you're asking everyone that question, which I don't necessarily think is a good idea. You single people out based on race, for example, or color. That is suggestive of bias. That's a microaggressive comment, which, as you can see at the top, equals bias, equal what is called legally a hostile comment, creates a hostile work and learning environment, and is illegal discrimination. Is really interesting, and I certainly see this in my teaching and scholarship and my work experience, that it's a continuum, and they're all connected to each other. Organizations where there are comments like my colleague has told me from Georgetown, comments like that, if they're a regular thing in a workplace or at school, then that's probably indicative that they are hostile comments, indicative of an organizational culture that abets comments like that, enables them, and then results in illegal discrimination. I use a lot of employment discrimination cases because I find many of them are so egregious that they provide excellent examples of what are hostile comments, what are microaggressions, and how they can accumulate and create a situation that is illegal. So as the court here said, a supervisor's use of certain unambiguous racial epithets is likely to alter the conditions of employment and create a hostile working environment, weighing heavily in the severity factor. And you could replace working environment with educational environment, whether in a public school, college, graduate program, that it all fits. So again, supervisor equating with leadership and setting the tone for an organization of whether or not comments like the ones the court refers to here are acceptable. This is just an awful case involving a transgender teenager in California a couple of years ago. Kyler was a transgender boy, and he was hospitalized with significant mental health issues. His mother, when he was hospitalized, asked the staff to refer to him with male pronouns, refer to him as a boy, that referring to him otherwise would cause severe emotional distress. This particular hospital was reputed in California to have specialty in dealing with transgender individuals, particularly transgender teenagers. Despite the requests of Mrs. Prescott, Kyler's mom, the staff regularly made microaggressive, biased, hostile comments that even if they themselves may not have viewed them that way, they went contrary to what Kyler's mom asked. Now, Kyler at the time, I think, was 14, so he's a minor. The custodial parent has final say, if you will, on this is how I want you to treat my child. And they disregarded it. Kyler had a very difficult stay in the hospital. And as you can see, despite his mom's repeated requests to stop what you're doing, don't say these things to him. They're very upsetting. Whether you agree with that or not, she's his mom. So I would like to think that if I asked, when my son was a minor, when I said to people, don't do this, don't do that, they would respect what I had to say. And certainly you would think that that would be true here. Well, the situation continued to get worse as the comments continued and indeed accelerated, and Kyler's mental health issues worsened. He suffered severe emotional distress in the hospital. And what was particularly significant, as you'll see on the next screen, the doctors in the hospital, realizing that he was undergoing severe emotional distress, decided to discharge him regardless of his mental health state, which was perilous, because the doctors were concerned that he was getting worse in the hospital because of staff comments. Think about that. He's in a facility to deal with mental health. His mental health is worsening because of the comments and conduct of the staff, contrary to his mother's request. The doctors discharged him because they were concerned about his mental health, of being in a mental health facility. Terribly, the end game here is awful. So as you can see at the top, he was depressed, suicidal. His providers decided that they would discharge him because they were concerned his condition was getting worse. As you can see, he was discharged on April 8th. 6 weeks later, he killed himself. So I think that I use this because it's yes, it's egregious. Yes, the consequences are beyond awful, but it shows what comments that may seem innocuous to some, that may not seem intentionally discriminatory, can be, and can have awful consequences. So his mom filed a federal civil rights lawsuit, which I believe she won. I don't know what the judgment or what the amount of money was offhand, but this, as I said, I use this regularly in this because it really does show in a real life setting what microaggressive comments can do. This is another case involving hostile comments in the workplace, and this concerned a healthcare provider that abetted requests by patients to not be treated by Black people, which is illegal. but the healthcare provider went along with the requests. And as a result, many of the employees got the message that, oh, we can call employees who work here who are Black or African American. Various epithets, hostile comments with no consequence. And things got pretty bad at this hospital too. The hospital lost its civil rights lawsuit that was brought by one of the employees. So as you can see, perhaps no single act can more quickly create an abusive working environment, an abusive situation like the faced by Kyler, than the use of an unambiguously racial epithet by a supervisor in the presence of subordinates. It sets a problematic tone and create this sense that, oh, it's okay for me to act this way, use these words, be denigrating to colleagues and other people. There's a great article in the New York Times last summer about microaggressions generally, and it was a focus on healthcare, and the focus was on female physicians of color. In the article, they talked about how they were not regarded as physicians. Instead, people asked if they were coming in to take, as you can see, this trash out, stuff they wouldn't ask a physician who was a white male. Microaggressive behavior is studied significantly in healthcare. So there are a lot of examples of this type of behavior, which I personally find very useful from an educational standpoint in explaining what we're talking about today. So I think these two paragraphs are really important, both from the perspective of understanding having a productive workplace situation, but also being in compliance with federal civil rights laws and your obligations as a federal funding recipient or a subrecipient from the city of Loveland. Increased awareness and understanding that the behaviors that I've suggested and talked about and comments are inappropriate, disturbing, and may well be illegal under our civil rights laws. Microaggressive behavior invariably is part of a macro organizational pattern and practice that enables hostile work and learning environments to exist and maintain themselves. I've seen many situations where this can be shut down amazingly quickly with strong messages from leadership that this behavior, these comments will not be tolerated, and if they continue, there will be consequences, including but not limited to termination. It's really phenomenal when you see leadership on board. They can affect change, dramatic change that is sustainable and becomes a new part of the culture of the organization. So rather than read this, I'm going to leave this for you to read. This is another employment case. This is a decision by the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission concerning Muhammad and his treatment by co-workers at a large automobile dealership. So I'll pause for a bit so you can read both paragraphs. One of the things that I find most remarkable about this is, if you've been to a car dealership, you know that on the main sale floor, the main sale floor is accessible or accessed or visible to leadership, to the general manager who's sitting at on a high counter on the floor. So these comments were made right on the main sale floor in front of coworkers, supervisors, and customers. And these comments just happened every day, and they were allowed to continue. So you can imagine, whatever your background is, whatever your ethnicity, your race, your national origin, that if you were called out in a similar way every day in front of colleagues, customers, and supervisors, imagine how you would feel and what consequences that would have to you personally, and also consequences that there might be to your career. And that's why the EEOC found, as you can see, reasonable cause that there was a hostile work environment violating Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So this is all, again, as part of next few slides, quotes from Psychology Today, and really get into the biochemical origin of bias. So as you can see, unconscious bias is measurable. widespread, and is disassociated with explicit conscious forms of bias. And it can now be cognitively and quantitatively validated. It is reflected in various attitudes that we have and stereotypes that affect our understanding, decision-making, and behavior, with the key being without consciously realizing it's happening. Until you have an understanding of where bias comes from and this biochemical origin story, then you may not be familiar with the thoughts, instincts, reactions that you have on a daily basis that are done in your brain without your necessarily consciously being aware of them. The second paragraph, I think, is really so key. The first step in solving any problem is to recognize that it exists and not deny it and not minimize it. So that's why I look at bias as a biochemical reality, that it's not a judgment. It's not saying that something is good or bad. We all have brains, and our brains all react the same way. So understanding the science related to identifying and conceptualizing bias, yes, I agree, helps us to recognize and acknowledge bias and its possible effects. And what are they? Well, psychologists have, of course, identified this implicit bias. Some can be the result of repeated and pervasive messages that establish and perpetuate stereotypes. Think about that St. Louis Cardinals ad that I talked about earlier, that seeing images like that may create some images, stereotypes in your brain, in our brains, that influence how we may behave in certain situations. So again, we're all biased, whether we know it or not, whether we're conscious of these stereotypes, we all are. The key becomes acknowledging that understanding, but also taking steps to affect, stop, alter the manifestations of bias in physical activity or outcomes. So the amygdala is part of our brain. It's the emotional center of the brain. It reacts to fear and threat and other senses. Scientists have found a measurable distinction, measurable correlation between amygdala activity and implicit bias. The point again is that research shows by visually looking at our brains, a visual brain response, even though we don't know that it's happening. But the amygdala is only part of the brain involved in unconscious or implicit bias. The frontal cortex is also identified as important in forming impressions of others and in measuring empathy. Memories such as dates and facts that we have stored throughout our lives also subconsciously steer us toward choosing one option over another when we're faced with decision making. According to my colleagues at Georgetown, medical research has revealed that implicit bias is found throughout the brain. So yes, it's centered often in the frontal cortex and the amygdala, but those are not the only parts of the brain where it can be found. There are useful aspects of bias that relate to our instinctual behaviors, like, for example, as you can see, our response, our environmental adaptation, survival, the fight-flight instinct, being able to quickly assess and respond to objectively dangerous stimuli. But these automatic responses to facial stimuli, for example, combined with social conditioning like the St. Louis Cardinals ad, for instance, can result in bias against individuals that is often based on race, but certainly not only based on race. Acknowledging that we all have bias is the first step toward reducing our reliance on these stereotypes and generalizations. And I know personally that I know that when I am having a bias reaction, that thinking through, well, why do I think this way? What am I reacting to? That I will notice some stimulus, some facial recognition, some memory that connects what's happening to me now to something that I experienced earlier in my life. I think that this is a really good summary and shows that bias reactions can be increased more by what you see on my left, the left side of the screen, but not decreased by the right, on the right. So bias reactions can increase when we're under stress, when we're under time pressure, a deadline, when we're multitasking, doing lots of things, when there are lack of clear criteria for making decisions, when we have ambiguous or incomplete information, so we rely on our instinct, we rely on images that have become part of our brains, and we have lack of familiarity with certain people or from a certain group. I think that it's important to remember that bias, since it's instinctive, it's an instinctive reaction. No matter what your intentions are, your brain's biochemical firing to create a bias reaction has nothing to do with good intentions, for example, or you're attempting to just kind of put a lid on everything and suppress that you're having a bias response, avoiding people from certain groups. And then I think one of the most problematic is thinking you don't have bias. You know, again, there are 330 million people, I think, living in the United States. We all have bias, and it is a natural part of being a human being. So I think that the whether or not you're well-intentioned has nothing to do with your having a bias instinct, a bias response. Again, it's what do you do with it? How is it manifested? What can you do to alleviate a biased or discriminatory manifestation? And this is just a good visual example from my med school colleagues about the frontal cortex. The amygdala you can see is in yellow, frontal cortex at the front of the brain in pink, temporal lobes. The amygdala description is the amygdala is associated with automatic responses to stimuli, the fear, fight, or flight response. Frontal cortex associated with reasoning, first impressions, and empathy. And I think at the bottom right, this is a really good example of a visual image that in various studies people have an instinctive automatic reaction to. But as my colleague says, if you celebrate me in my scrubs, don't hate me in my hoodie. And that represents that manifestation of bias, potential manifestation of bias that can result in discriminatory activity, illegal activity under our civil rights laws, and violate your agreements as federal funding recipients or subrecipients. I just happen to like this. It's a good example of how quickly our brains work. And we can look at this. And even though the words and the letters are scrambled, we can kind of quickly come up with what this says and what it means. What I think is really good about this, it just shows you that these reactions are microseconds in length. They're quick, they're almost instantaneous, and it shows how our brains work. So that in a way that makes the task of avoiding illegal discriminatory manifestations of bias involves some work and involves some thought and thinking about, wait a minute, why am I treating this person differently than that person? Even if it took you a little longer to read, as I mentioned, your unconscious cognition automatically made sense of the paragraph based on your ability to associate it with words you already know. And that's kind of our instinctive bias reaction, in a sense, where our brains are relying on information that's already there, that we've already seen, that we've already internalized, that we may not even remember, but it's here. Great book about just reacting to, this is about doctors specifically, but it really applies to everybody, that in an emergency type of situation, in a stress situation, time-sensitive details are being sorted really fast. Remember, I mentioned earlier that time-sensitive situations can create more problematic manifestations of bias because we may not have the time or the temperament because of the stress to work through a biased response. And I think the last bullet is really informative. Drawing on stereotypes to make decisions can miss some relevant information. If I rely on stereotypes that I may have in my brain connected to that St. Louis Cardinals ad about women not liking baseball and instead liking jewelry, then that image that I see is going to reinforce that potential biased image that I have in my brain, and I may react in a way that is discriminatory or create some kind of disparate treatment based on gender. This is a great case, and I bring this up because it's a wonderful example of how discriminatory behavior can be internalized here by a small city in Florida going back to the 1970s. But I find that this quote from the federal court is really instructive. Discriminatory intent, our intending to act in a discriminatory way, is everything we do and everything we don't do. So if we see a situation at work, like the situation involving Muhammad, for example, and we don't intervene, we don't do anything to stop it. We don't go up to Muhammad to ask him if he's okay. We don't go to the general manager and say, you just have to prevent this. Then isn't that also some type of bias response on some level? I know it can be difficult socially in certain situations with group dynamics to act in a way that is contrary to what the majority is doing. But what's so interesting about this case, but also in innumerable studies, is our intent to treat people differently in a negative way comes from what we do and what we choose not to do. So I always leave this question with my audiences and with my students. It's a good way to kind of trigger what kind of responses you're having. Are your encounters different because of someone's race, color, language, sex, religion, sexual orientation, sexual identity, or national origin? I use these words because these are all called protected categories under federal law. There are federal laws prohibiting discrimination against these categories. So thinking about, well, wait a minute, am I treating this person differently because this person doesn't speak English well, or is in a wheelchair, or has a skin color that's different than mine? I think if you use this, invariably you will find, if you are having some type of bias response, this may help alleviate the situation and may help you avoid some type of discriminatory activity that violates federal law. And this is just a quote from the court decision, but I like it because of the underlying portions, connects with the whole aspect of bias and cognition that we've been discussing. So the court found that this particular city, the city of Apopka, had engaged in a systematic pattern of cognitive acts and omissions going back for years concerning municipal services that inescapably evidences discriminatory intent. In this particular town, there was a predominantly white part of town and a predominantly black part of town. Some residents in the predominantly black part of town sued, claiming that the services they received were discriminatory. They weren't as reliable or efficient or as good as the services that were provided in the predominantly white part of town. They won. They won in the trial court, they won on appeal, and the details, which we're not going to talk about today, are particularly significant and obvious when you read about how the services were provided quite differently, depending on what side of town you lived on or lived in. This is another EEOC complaint against a nationally known retailer whose name you'll see on the next slide when you see the court citation. So I'm going to just go through this quickly, and you can see that this is an excellent example of microaggressive behavior involving Chinasa and her supervisor. So Chinasa, hired by a national retailer, had a Nigerian accent. So executive who would oversee her work approaches her whether it's the first day or pretty soon after that, after she was promoted, and said, I bet this is a great achievement considering where you came from. As an African, you must be the first to achieve this much success in your family, given your accent. Well, there are a lot of assumptions being made here. And as you can see, those assumptions built upon themselves to create the situation you'll see on the next slide. And as the last paragraph, the executive is making assumptions of how a particular race of people, the stereotype of how they act, and what his opinion is of these actions and of them. What's interesting is, despite the executive's stereotypes, despite his assumptions, the people that Shanasa supervised had no trouble understanding her. They didn't think that her accent was difficult to understand. They responded to her immediately. They enjoyed working with her, and they thought she was a great supervisor. But her boss thought differently, and after 9 months, she was fired. And as you can see here, she was fired because the supervisor claimed that she was a poor fit, and then he also said that she didn't speak more like an American. Well, the EEOC found cause that there was a discrimination here, and they sued. You can see the name of the retailer at the bottom of the screen. But I think that this case is a great example, again, of how microaggressive comments and behaviors from leadership can create a hostile work environment, a difficult, discriminatory, illegal work environment. These are comments that were, the assumptions underlying them were disagreed with by the very staff people, the employees, whom this particular supervisor, Chinasa, was tasked with overseeing. So that is certainly, to me, is indicative of bias playing into the supervisor's assumptions about her, since his assumptions were completely different than the people that she worked with. So again, what do you do? I'm betting that many of you, if not all of you, have encountered comments that are similar to the comments that we've been discussing today, whether they've been directed at you, colleagues, comments directed at friends that you've heard about. These are comments that are, if you follow EEOC court cases, that occur with troubling frequency. So if this happens in your organization, well, what do you do? But I think it's important is, what tools can you bring to the table to deal with them? Well, education, of course, is a big part of it. Examining and understanding the attitudes that we've been discussing, and understanding implicit bias and where it comes from, and then acquiring the skills to communicate effectively and negotiate across or with different people. And I think that one of the ways to do that is remembering that no matter what your background, your religion, your race, your ethnicity, if you find yourself in the situation of the people that you've met today, how would you feel? What would you do? Would you want to go back to that workplace, classroom, hospital? And I think that that can help inform a greater response to avoid the discriminatory and illegal activities that we've seen today. It's also interesting too that studies, and this is a Harvard Business Review study, that diversity and inclusive workplaces drive growth, make money. And this embracing inclusion and diversity are profit centers and can have significant economic and financial benefits to the organizations that have this type of organizational culture. As you can see here, this is really a fascinating study that I refer to all the time. If you look at diversity on boards of directors, according to this study, and this one based on gender, that from a return of equity, return on equity, return on sales, return on invested capital, look at the percentages of growth, of return, of profit by companies that had more diverse boards of directors. It's really phenomenal. These are not insignificant figures. We're not talking 1 or 2%. almost 70%, 53%, over 40%. So that this having tolerant, inclusive, diverse workplaces not only are likelier to lead you to being in compliance with federal civil rights laws and your obligations as federal funding recipients, but they'll make money. They also create more productive workforces, having employees more interested in staying with your company or organization longer, having a overall more harmonious, more productive workforce and workplace. And this correlation between gender diversity on boards and performance was found across all industries. It's not just one particular industry. It's not just technology or healthcare. It's everything. This study is, from 2017, is really fascinating, where the researchers sought to study why top-level leaders are disproportionately white men. And they came up with an answer that they didn't expect. And as you can see, that's suggested in the second paragraph, that if there are women or ethnic minorities, for example, who advocate for greater diversity, they often are discouraged from advocating these types of values, whether by being denied promotions, being denied other professional opportunities. As you can see here, that this diversity valuing behavior is rewarded if it is pushed or advocated by white men, but not by women who may be a minority in the workforce, or by minorities. As I said, this is also fascinating study. I use this all the time and I refer to it a lot. It's just a really interesting kind of double-edged sword aspect in a way to championing, advocating for diversity and tolerance in the workplace or in the classroom. This was in the Harvard Business Review 3 years ago. And this tells the story of Dr. Rabinowitz, who was a senior resident in an intensive care unit. She supervised a male physician. They had a difficult conversation with the patient and patient's family, patient's spouse. After they left, the patient's wife, I think, called the clinic, called the ICU to talk to the doctor, the lead doctor. But even though they had just met, the spouse assumed that Dr. Rabinowitz was not the lead. They assumed that her colleague, her junior colleague, who was a male physician, was the lead. So not only was there that gender distinction, but most significantly, Dr. Rabinowitz and also her male colleague the male colleague did not intervene to tell the patient, well, Dr. Rabinowitz is the lead, is the director of the clinic, so she can best, you're really calling to speak to her. What the two doctors here, what really knocked them out was they'd gone through training. They had sat, as you can see, they sat through lectures on bias. But they looked at it from the standpoint of relating to patients and not to colleagues, not to each other. So one of the takeaways from this is, wow, bias is a little more significant and widespread than we thought. It's not just about dealing with customers or dealing with patients. It's about dealing with each other, dealing with my office mate, dealing with the person in the next cubicle, dealing with the person down the hall or across the hall. I think these are great suggestions from my Georgetown colleagues about, all right, so what do we do? How do we solve this? Well, let's look at the 4 clues that are suggested on the left. Understand bias is normal, we all have it. And reducing it can be, I think it's a good description. It's like breaking a habit. It takes time and it takes some awareness and conscious activity, realizations, and behavior to alter our biased responses. Be aware of our biases and assess or think about, why do we react that? Why am I reacting that way? Why do I react so quickly in a way that in certain situations is biased? Realize the impact. that just as I explained about my Asian American colleague in Georgetown and Kyler and Chinasa, there is a real significant, sometimes awful consequence to the manifestations of bias. Replace the biases in the sense of thinking more broadly and being aware of stereotypes and how to counter them. And the suggestion on the right about using this the acronym PAUSE, pay attention to the reality of the situation, acknowledge your reaction, understand that there are other possible reactions and motivations, search for a solution, and do evaluation. That, you know, as I said, when I'm having a response that I recognize is biased, and thinking about why, and hopefully being able to stop some type of manifestation of what I have recognized to be bias. So looking at what's on the left and the right, I think it'd be really helpful in doing that. And this is just some additional advice from Georgetown about bias responses in the workplace, and like in the number 2, I thought that this was very interesting about a senior attending physician speaking to students and residents, and one resident saying, I felt uncomfortable when Mr. J spoke only to the men on our team. I wonder if anyone else noticed that. Very subtle, very nuanced, but a microaggressive response. Well, how do the women feel? Who else noticed that? Or flip it. If the person, the leader, the supervisor is only speaking to women in a group of men and women, how do the men feel about that? So these, I'm sure that you're like I am, and you've seen this happen and are aware of this behavior. But think about, did other people see that, or what do they think about that? Again, a reminder, ask yourself this question. Do you treat people differently because of any of these protected categories? If the answer is yes, the odds are that your response is a biased one and can be problematic under federal civil rights laws. Remember, whether or not you're acting in a discriminatory way is both what you do and what you don't do. And as the Court of Appeal said here, it's the cumulative evidence of everything, of our actions and our inactions, that objectively manifests discrimination. That's my contact information. So I think it's good timing. So that's the presentation for today. I hope that this has been beneficial, interesting, informative. I'm going to stop the screen share and happy to address any comments and questions.
Bruce, before we get into questions, I want to say a couple of things to the people who are participating to also gain some further context. So in 2019, we asked all of you who had current grants to submit an ADA policy, a Title VI or non-discrimination policy, and a grievance policy to our office. We had 3 technical assistance meetings that spring to help you with your policies. We then reviewed them, almost all of them. I mean, I think there were 2 that we didn't actually get to, and I had some questions potentially for Bruce, but we reviewed them to make sure that you had the proper language. And what I want to say about today's meeting and the meeting next week is to make sure that you know what your obligations are. So Bruce did all of this work around implicit bias so that you would understand not just that we have these policies that we need to complete, but also, as he said, it includes everything we do and everything we don't do, to really have a sense of what implicit bias is so that you are hopefully even more motivated to work on these policies. These policies, which we'll go over in more detail a week from today about what needs to be included, are also designed to help you train your staff and your volunteers so that they understand the purpose of this work, why you're doing it, and why it's so important. You know, to quote one of my favorite HUD employees, he used to say, it isn't just the law, it's the right thing to do. So for the next meeting, what I would request is that you dig up your policies that you submitted to our office, ADA, Title VI, or non-discrimination, and your grievance policy. Let's open it up to questions, and you can either unmute yourself or use the raise your hand function. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you. Yes, Tom.
Yeah, I'd like to share a short story that struck me very recently. About a week ago, my wife and I were out doing a series of errands. We had our kids pack stuff on. We stopped at a local sandwich shop, and we had ordered, we were waiting. Young lady, probably in her mid-20s or so, had a fair amount of tattoos on her, and she ordered, and as she turned away from the register, she looked at us and said, have a great day. And we returned the compliment. A minute or so later, I went up to pick up the sandwiches and pay. She had paid our lunch.
Oh.
And we sat there somewhat dumbfounded for a few seconds, and then realized that we had characterized her because of the tattoos, and felt pretty small. And then we said, wow, why would she do that? We've never seen her before. And then our only summation was that she saw the kids pack stuff, and that maybe she knew that she had received our food bags before, or somebody had gotten them. And we had quite a learning experience.
Thank you, Todd. That's a great story. And if you don't mind, my son is coming home from college tomorrow. That's a story that I know he will love, because we're always having these really interesting generational conversations. So thank you very much for that. Nina, your hand is up.
Yeah, I was just going to ask that you would repeat the reason why white men are found to be in positions of higher leadership over.
You mean, I'm sorry, according to that study?
Yes, please.
Yeah, the study found that in organizations, and I think they looked at private businesses, that for people in these organizations who advocated for a greater diversity or greater tolerance, that they found that the people who were rewarded with promotions, increased salaries, or greater professional acclaim and opportunities tended to be white men, that women and ethnic and racial minorities who may have advocated in exactly the same way were not similarly recognized. So that it's not a conclusion in a way, it's a hanging question is, okay, well, if this is the only group that's being rewarded, then how can we deal with situations in workplaces where people who may arguably be either even greater advocates for diversity are either equally or more significantly rewarded than white men, than the group that is typically in majority positions on boards of directors and throughout leadership in private business, for example. So, as I had said, that was a conclusion that I don't think the authors expected. They didn't expect to find that women and ethnic and racial minorities who advocated for diversity were not as recognized, and arguably might have been punished by not receiving the same benefits, raises, or promotions as white men. So that was what the study concluded.
Thank you.
Sure, you're welcome. Pam, you have your hand up.
I just wanted to share a brief story too that I had when I was younger and early onto the field. I was covering the front desk at a nonprofit, and somebody said that a staff member from WIC was going to stop by and pick up some paperwork. And so maybe an hour later, somebody unknown to me came to the front desk and said, she didn't say anything. I just greeted her and said, "Hey, are you here to pick up the WIC paperwork?" And her feelings were really hurt. She was a professional from another organization and she was a person of color. And she assumed that I meant that she was a recipient of WIC, that I had looked at her and made that decision that she was a client. And afterwards, I felt really bad because I kind of put 2 and 2 together and figured out what had happened. And I sent her a card just to say, I apologize. This was a situation. And it made me realize that and Lord knows, I don't always like remember to do this, but I've tried to remember that you have to be careful what you say because you don't always know someone else's experiences and what could make them feel like they're not being treated as a professional.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think that that's a great story and really does show that these responses, they're a natural part of being human. We have likely, each one of us had some type of similar reaction. And I know that there are times if I see someone in our neighborhood that I don't recognize who maybe looks differently than I do, I may think, well, wait a minute, why are you here? And then I think about, kind of what you were suggesting and think about, well, why am I reacting that way? And of course, if there were some manifestation of that, then I would like to think that I would act as you did. But knowing that we have these instinctive, immediate reactions, it's part of being human, understanding them, but also kind of moving away from the sense that, I mean, frankly, I've never really understood when people talk about it. My students ask me about political correctness. I don't really understand what that means, because in a way, this is all related to how would I like somebody to treat me, make assumptions about me, make assumptions about my ethnicity, my religion, my national origin by looking at me, by listening to me. And am I being treated differently, negatively, disparately because of assumptions that people make, which I know has happened to me, and typically happens to, if it hasn't happened to everyone here, I'm confident it has happened to people that all of us know, and in ways that, as Pam said, and as Tom had mentioned earlier, that are day-to-day occurrences. Sometimes, though, these situations can become, as we saw with Kyler and as we saw with Shanasa, awful, that the results can be just terrible, both from, as a parent, but also as somebody who, understands what, it's like to be in an office setting, and to have somebody treated like Muhammad was in the slide that we talked about. So yes, Queen has a question.
This one hits home for me a lot. So my lived experience right here in Laramie County, Fort Collins, was actually having had an organization that was set up to help my family and I get through a hard time, tell me if I wanted to be around more Black people, then I should move to Denver. Now, today, I'm going to chalk that up to this person in leadership not knowing what you're sitting here today saying is illegal, unmoral, and everything like that. Because of that experience, I gave birth to 2 nonprofits because that support was not there for me. And I realized the environment, like I said in the chat, it's different when the microaggressiveness is in a comment, because I can turn my back on you and I can walk away because you're ignorant. But when your whole organization or the whole environment stinks and reeks with microaggressions, what do? You have to give birth to your own nonprofit. With that being said, is there some type of structure of women that we have? And I'm sure I could be jumping the gun a bit, Miss Allison. If there is a structure of women that we've devised, or a community of women that we've devised to look over different situations of microaggressions, because my fear is I have a family in my community that comes to me and say, I'm gonna pick on you, Pam. I went to Homewood Alliance and a staff member over there said something really ugly to me. And I know that it is illegal and immoral. What do? Do we have a structure of women that are saying, all right, let me get that complaint. Let me look through it. And then I, in my grace, am gonna go to Homewood Alliance and have that conversation with them and maybe talk to them about getting some help in microaggression relief.
Queen, that's a really great comment that I love that you made. And maybe you and I let's start talking about that. And if anyone else wants to join in that kind of a conversation, put your name in the chat.
And yes, and thank you. And I would add a couple points to that. I think that's also, Allison mentioned earlier, having a grievance and complaint procedure. Well, part of that and part of what the feds do, and this was in Colorado. I don't want to identify the organization, but I worked with an organization that was being investigated by the feds for discrimination. And the first question that the feds asked in the interviews on the day of the investigation, show us your grievance and complaint procedure and explain how people who feel they've been discriminated against can tell you. And what do you do about it? So I am a big believer in consequences and in results, in the sense that if something happens, as I said rhetorically, what do you do about it? So there have to be, that's where, you talked about what you've done with birthing 2 nonprofits. You create your own organizational culture, you create your own dynamic workplace, organizational priorities. But then as part of that, the message is there are consequences. And there have been situations that I've been involved in where I've been asked, what should we do given this person's pattern and practice of microaggressive behavior and discrimination? Well, we bring the person in, tell the person this will not be tolerated, that it is illegal under federal law. And if it happens again, then you won't work here anymore. These are the priorities that we have in this organization. We don't do that. We don't talk to people like that. We don't treat people like that. And we don't have acts, activities, and conduct that will discriminate, treat people differently, negatively, but have the impacts that I'm sure you've all seen, experienced, read about. That's organizational culture. And what to me has always been amazing is the organizations that have the best training, real training. I'm not talking about 5-minute, hi, welcome, and don't be a bad person. Real effective training that really gets down to it and explains what needs to happen, policies that are followed and are compliant, and consequences that are regularly applied. Those are the best places. They tend not to have these issues. They tend not to get in trouble. They tend not to have my friends from the Justice Department visit them, and they tend not to get sued for the employment discrimination that we saw. So thank you for your comment. And I think that, your comment also shows that I've been making more of a priority to discuss microaggressions, because as I've heard more and more about them, seen them more and more and talked to people more and more, particularly my students, they just tell me these awful stories of these regular comments and activities that are not only denigrating, but treat them differently. I don't know if you heard recently, there were some two law professors, I think, I forgot the name of the law school, on the East Coast, where they were caught on a Zoom call saying that we, or at least one of them, I think, grades students differently based on color. Now, she was terminated after these comments arose, but what I found really the most revealing, but for her not pressing the leave button on Zoom, no one would have known that this is how she felt, how her bias impacted her job, and how her bias negatively impacted her students. So these comments, these attitudes all have consequences. They're not one-offs, they're not innocuous. They have significant meaning and sometimes really negative effects. Anybody else?
Dave Boone?
Yeah, I'm a little confused over something, Bruce. I want to ask you a question. You talked about what our choices are or what we choose not to do. And then you said, are your encounters different because of a person's race, color, gender, ethnicity, things like this? I need you to correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I was in Baltimore recently and I was coming out of a dollar store. I was at the checkout counter and I noticed as an African-American gentleman, and he had a young girl with him, probably about 6, was leaving the store. They stopped him and searched his bag and looked at the receipt. And I thought I caught that. I was still at the checkout counter. So I when I was done, they just kind of waved me through out the front door. And I went out in the parking lot and I asked him if they had actually searched his bag. And he said, yes. And I said, that's just not right. And he says, it happens all the time here. And I said, that's just not right. And I actually walked back in the store and asked for the manager and pretty much read him the riot act. But from the way you presented it, that would be wrong to do. And I thought I was doing the right thing. Correct me. Is that a good behavior? I find now, as an example, if I'm in my car and I drive by somebody that's been pulled over, I will look and see just, do they look different, ethnicity, things like that. And if there's a bit of a confrontation, I would go back. More to be, not to their aid, but to try to help if I can. Is that wrong?
No, absolutely not, David. I think those are great examples. When the inaction would be the opposite in a sense of what you did. So in the context of racial profiling, those are great examples of both implicit and explicit bias, where someone is making a decision, making an assumption based on how a person looks, what the person's race is, for example, and then acting accordingly. And you juxtaposed your experience at the same real time being different than the family that you described. So I think that that's a great example of both implicit and explicit bias, that your action is a great example of the opposite of being discriminatory, that you are intervening, you are aware of a situation where people are being treated differently because of race, and asking the question, wait a minute, why are you doing that? So yeah, I mean, I applaud that. I think that's excellent. But I think that you saw in real time, which we often don't necessarily experience, someone immediately in front of you being treated differently, and by differently in this context, it's negatively, discriminatorily, because of race. So that doesn't always happen, but when it does, it's very powerful because it really does put into shape exactly what we're talking about. So I thank you very much for that.
Are there any more questions of Bruce? Well, thank you, everyone. We will see you again next week, same time, same place. Again, please pull out your ADA, Title VI or non-discrimination and grievance policies. I know that not all of you have them. If you don't have one and you want to send me an email, we can help you get one put together. And we'll see you next week to further the discussion about creating your limited English proficiency and effective communication plans so that people have equal and equitable access to your programs. Really appreciate your being here. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.